Yeah, and thanks to all of you for being here, for coming to listen to me and to celebrate with me. It's been such a pleasure to see so many loved faces in one room. I will start with that. As per tradition, I would like to also begin with acknowledging those who encouraged me along the way, who set me on my path, and who kindly offered support and mentorship over the years. First of all, my mother, Ferda Susam, whose "you can do it" attitude has helped me come a long way. Sağ ol annem, beni her zaman maddi, manevi desteklediğin için, beni dinlemeye buralara kadar geldiğin için, ama ağlama, tamam mı? Professor Saliha Paker, Emeritus Professor at my alma mater, Boğaziçi University, who prompted me into my academic career and encouraged me to take the leap for a PhD abroad. Professor Thea Hermans, Emeritus Professor, University College London, who taught me how to be critical and hopefully constructive at the same time. He has kindly joined us here today. Professor Andrew Chesterman, Emeritus Professor, University of Helsinki, for helping me feel at home in the Finnish academic environment and encouraging me to get my first publications out at the time. Professor Mona Baker, Emeritus Professor, University of Manchester, currently at the University of Oslo, for teaching me how to edit, which skill I find very, very important, and for being a model academic and colleague over some 25 years, even though from a distance. Peter Graves, I was hoping he would be here today, but I think he couldn't make it, for his support during my first years of settling in at the University of Edinburgh. He's definitely not here. Okay, I was going to say for coming and joining us today. And now for more recent collaborations, Dr. Jenny Patterson, I know she's here. Dr. Jenny Patterson, for being the best research partner I could wish for, as well as a dear friend. Colleagues at the LLC Research Office, Janet Black, Laura Tomlinson, and Anya Pogachnik. She's luckily on leave at the moment, on holiday. For all the support you have given me for grant applications and project management, and for putting up with my endless questions. You know them better than anybody. No grants, no professorship, so I believe that this is as much your success as mine. Thank you. Colleagues in translation studies, I really believe that you're a really nice bunch to work with, and that gives me the energy to do the research I'm doing. With some of you for more than 2 decades. Wow. Charlotte Bosso, Hepzibah Israel, Mavis Ho, who couldn't be here with us today, Karin Boshart, who came despite the fact that she just moved house literally today. Thank you, Karin, specifically. Esther Tilsley, Xiaopeng Bao, who cannot be with us, and Alice Kilpatrick and Sharon Dean Cox, who are our honorary staff members forever. Okay. Colleagues at LLC, for making this building a very welcoming place to come, with particular thanks to, and they literally came in, at least one of them. Colleagues in LLC for making this place a very welcome place to work, especially with thanks to Alex Thompson, who couldn't be with us today, and Frauke Mattes. Thanks for being here. Colleagues from the Edinburgh Environmental Humanities Network and the Edinburgh Climate Research Leaders Program. I see some familiar faces here, thanks for being here. Dr. Alex South, with whom we can talk about cetaceans for hours. He's at a rehearsal today, he couldn't attend. Colleagues from Harriet Watt, hey, thanks for being here and cheering me on for interdepartmental support. Our MSc and PhD MSc and PhD in Translation Studies students, both now and over the years. Thanks for being here. Royal Society of Edinburgh and Leverhulme Trust for the funding they have generously contributed or offered over the last few years. And my friends who could make it today, Chidam, Susie, James and Yeni, you're all in different places of the room. Marion, and I hope I haven't forgotten anybody, and particularly Outi Palaposki, who came all the way from Helsinki via London. If I have forgotten any of my friends, you can come and beat me up at the end. But that's, I think, it. Last but not least, my family. I know they'll be very embarrassed, so I left them to the end. Ah, would you? Sorry. Thanks to Vadim Sarayev, Denis Sergei Sarayev, Alexei Kerim Sarayev, for being here, even though you were dragged, practically. Family in Australia, now I need to look into the camera, Dasha Saraeva and Liam Waring. I hope you'll get to watch this eventually. And thanks, Dasha, for being a fervent supporter of my writing, both academic and otherwise. So that's the bit over. And as I said, if I have forgotten anybody, hopefully not. So today I will be talking about the translation rights of the modern human. But before we do that, I know several people always ask me, how do you come from translation studies into humanities and then you ended up talking about whales? So I will give a very quick research trajectory as it's traditional to give some information on the professor's career in the inaugural lectures. So I started with literary theories. I was exploring how literary theories travel through translation, which introduced me to French feminism and how it was translated. So I started working on gender for many, many years, and I still work on gender, really. This was the time I was doing my PhD, so research methods were always at the forefront for me. What sort of research methods are available in my discipline, whether I can contribute to these methods. And then once the PhD was over, I was like, I had enough of this abstract theories. I want to work on something more corporeal, and I ended up working on music. And that's still an area I dabble in every now and then. Then I became a doula. A doula is someone who attends births, supports parents during pregnancy and labor and birth, which led me to my work on health, particularly maternal health. And that's another area which is slowly, I mean, it's been 10 years or so that I'm still slowly writing in, which led me to non-professionals translating and interpreting, because there were many people working in this field who did not call themselves translators or interpreters, but they were acting as translators and interpreters. And then there came a time I said, we cannot talk about human health if you are not talking about the health of the earth, which led me to eco-translation. So that's the area I will be talking about today, with particular focus on interspecies communication. So when I look back, and this inaugural gave me the chance to look back, I think the thread that runs through all these topics is power, representation, and ethics. So these are the areas that tied my research areas together. So maybe there is some method to this madness, you know, when you look at it. So I wanted to focus on interspecies communication today because I know that whales always attract people, as you can see. It's a more engaging topic than many other topics that I have worked on. It's more optimistic sometimes than at least maternal health. But also because I have a slight ambition to kind of shift your viewpoint on certain matters over the next 40 minutes or so. I want to fight against this illusion of separation and superiority that we seem to be stuck with, which is the root of all the killings that we are witnessing of humans, of forests, rivers, oceans, all animate and inanimate beings. It's become a cliche, almost a cliche, to say that we need new stories, new narratives, new frameworks, and that's just one attempt among a million that I'm trying to present you today. So that's why I focused on this topic. To be able to say something about this topic, of course, I need to mention briefly what we mean by eco-translation, in which my research project is based. It's about challenging the prevalent human-centeredness and language-centeredness in translation studies. Obviously, we are here in the School of Literatures, Languages and Cultures, and when you were coming to this building, you had absolutely no doubt that we will be talking about, you know, human languages and cultures. And eco-translation is trying to basically challenge that idea, because we know that translation is not limited to human communication systems. It takes place among multiple species, and between their languages and cultures and human ones. So that was number one. That's what eco-translation does. And number two, it explores a post-humanist understanding of translation. It aims at dethroning the anthropos, as we understand it. Anthropos usually referring to a certain class, a certain gender, a certain race. So it's hopes for dethroning the anthropos in all areas of life and in all academic disciplines, including translation studies. So I will be talking about these points on and off throughout the talk, but before I do that, I just thought we will do the fun part. I brought you 3 videos, 3 very short videos. So for the first one, thank you, Alexey Kerim-Sarayev, for the editing. And the music credits go to eSoundtracks. Right. Does anyone know what's happening here? Or have you seen this before, let's say, not in real life, but on documentaries or anything? You have. Do you know what might be happening there? Hunting, yeah. It's a hunting, it's a feeding behavior of particularly humpback whales. This was shot in British Columbia. And what they are doing is called bubble net feeding. So several humpbacks can come together and then blow bubbles, make a spiral, trap the fish, mostly herring, and then they guide them up, and they all come and eat them up, okay? So this is probably a scene that you have seen in the documentaries, just out of curiosity. Anyone seen in real life? Yes. Okay, so you will know what it actually sounds like, right? It doesn't sound like this. So, okay, so this is the actual video without the editing and without the music. I would like you to pay attention to the sounds in the environment. Ignore my excited shouts, okay?
Bubbles over there.
That big thing. Oh my God. Oh my.
Oh, I hope my iOS is okay.
Wow.
iOS is too hot.
Can you hear the breathing? Okay. And the cameras, because people are IDing, it wasn't just for pleasure, people are trying to ID these humpbacks, the researchers I'm working with. Okay, so this is more like the, behind the scenes in David Attenborough movies, right? without the music part, okay. This is what we associate the sounds with in that particular feeding incident. So the very last video, even shorter than these two, is again me. Excuse the really bad cameramanship because I was extremely excited. I will explain why I was excited. And there they are, the second group who are feeding over there. The reason of my excitement is I had been hearing these sounds for like 10 days or so before this big group turned up. And it was always very faint. On that screen, I was spending hours. If you saw that green squiggly bits, I was sitting in front of the screen. I was hearing these sounds. They were always so far away. And this was the first time the group came in front of us. And on that screen, I could see it just going through the roof. Everything is green. So this is the sound they make when they are bubble net feeding. The sound is part of the trap. It is thought to stun the fish, but at the same time, it helps as a way of attracting other humpbacks, indicating that there's a feeding event going on there. The reason I wanted to start the talk with these 3 videos is most of the time, we are familiar with the very first video. We see the event visually, but there's always a frame, there's always a filter. It's either music or a narrator, much that I love David Attenborough, obviously, but there's always somebody telling us what's going on there. We hardly get a chance to hear the more than human on their own terms. Obviously here it's still mediated, it's still the hydrophones, it's still the speakers, but then this is the sound they are making. So I want you to bear that in mind throughout the talk, this difference between how we perceive the more than human and how they may be actually communicating with each other. The research that gave rise to this talk the project was called Translation and Cetacean Communication Systems, Interactions and Synergies, and it took place in these 3 different marine research centers. The first one that's hot is the North Coast Cetacean Society, and that's where I had taken these videos on the very deck. You can see the second one is Monterey Bay, when we were out doing the field work on the boats. The Liverham International Fellowship allowed me to discipline hop, as they call it, to come from humanities and to go into marine biology, marine ecology specifically, to spend some time with the researchers doing their field work, shadowing them, participating in some of the research, and mostly interviewing them with my really weird questions, they thought. The strands of the research project are knowledge translation, that is, the way scientific knowledge is shared with policy makers and the general public, mainly for conservation and mitigation purposes. Then representation of cetaceans in museums, aquariums, and exploration centers, and ethical issues around the ongoing efforts to translate their communication systems. So today I'll be sharing my thoughts, and these are very much thoughts at this stage. This is work in progress, so when you are grilling me, please bear that in mind. Though echoes of the other 2 will also be heard. To make sense of this talk, you will need a very short background on passive acoustic monitoring, as it's called, PAMs. So what they use is hydrophones, like the ones you see here in this picture. They are deployed to capture sounds from the aquatic environment. They are usually stationary on the ocean floor. Bioacousticians analyze this data, often through the use of AI. I know my translation studies colleagues are just prickling at the sound of the word, trained in pattern recognition. Coupled with observational studies of animal behavior, this acoustic data can tell a great deal about the lives of cetaceans and form the basis of information provided to policymakers, military, shipping, fossil fuel exploration, or offshore renewable energy companies to mitigate their impact on marine habitats. They also contribute to the establishment of marine protected areas and marine sanctuaries. So this is what the bioacoustics is usually used for. However, beyond these more common endeavors of bioacoustics, translating non-human communication through large-scale biotagging has become a burgeoning field. For instance, the multi-species efforts of the Earth Species Project, the sperm whale specific translation undertaken by Project SETI, basically translation is in their name, it's the Cetacean Translation Initiative. The 10 million prize by Collar Doolittle Challenge for Interspecies Two-Way Communication. This year it was awarded to dolphin non-signature whistles, a project working on dolphin non-signature whistles. And experiments of alleged conversations with humpbacks by Whale SETI, which actually focuses on communication with the extraterrestrial. So it's quite a wide range of projects, initiatives going on. I would argue that if a process begins to be called translation, even if tentatively, it may help to see what translation entails in its earlier human context. The wider ethical issues that have been part and parcel of human translation processes and their academic study may be relevant to the translation of cetacean communication. This, of course, risks triggering the ecologist's internalized trepidation against anthropomorphism. So, why are you talking about animals in human terms? Which is a very, very valid concern. Their training and education instills in them a strong caution against anthropomorphism, to the extent that any similarity between humans and non-humans are to be disregarded. However, the opposite end of the spectrum, that is anthropodenial, I argue, is equally blinding, or maybe equally blinding. So in what follows, I want to approach the communication systems of cetaceans, I keep saying cetaceans, I didn't even define, right? I take it for granted. It's whales, dolphins, and porpoises. That's what it means. So I want to approach their communication systems through 4 different angles. The first one is language, translation, and untranslatability in the context of whales. I will then focus on why colonial and patriarchal capitalist heritage is relevant to the bioacoustics research carried out on whale vocalizations. I will continue with the thorny question of who has the right to represent whom that Aaron briefly introduced at the start, and conclude with some thoughts on translation rights. I suspect you have come across images like this online. We all have our thoughts about it, but this one is all about the mess we are currently in and its causes. The fact that some living beings seem to think that they are at the top of the pyramid, while the rest seems to be just organized more or less in this kind of hierarchical structure. This is usually referred to as anthropocentrism. Another visualization, which is obviously not ideal, it's just one example that I could find online, is about ecocentrism, where these kind of hierarchical relationships will ideally be broken down. In terms of language, this pyramid is very much still the norm. When we refer to language, people understand human language. And within that, we know that some human languages are regarded as more legitimate, complex, richer than others due to the socioeconomic power of those who speak them. So we have distinctions like majority languages and minoritized languages. Non-human communication systems are even less visible because of the same hierarchical relationships. Even the term language can be an emotional topic when you are talking to bioacousticians, partly due to a desire to claim human uniqueness and superiority. The deeply entrenched us versus them mentality of humans trying to distinguish themselves from non-human animals and the conditions of living associated with them may be a key factor in the labels chosen. We call them sounds, calls, vocalizations, or the term I prefer, communication systems, though, as you will see, I sometimes like to saying language in short. Within the cetacean communication systems, similar hierarchical dynamics are at play. Some species languages are studied more than others, namely those of humpback whales, bottlenose dolphins, orcas, and recently through SETI sperm whales. The unease that accompanies the term language among whale bioacousticians can also stem from a different concern, that language is being used as a benchmark against which non-human communication systems are measured. So their argument is that cetaceans have had 50 million years to develop their communication systems compared to that of humans, which is obviously a much shorter time span. Regardless of the differing departure points, this resistance to referring to the communication systems of cetaceans as languages is also reflected in the unease that accompanies the term translation. Most bioacousticians I have spoken to have emphasized that they are not trying to understand the meaning of any given sign, but rather its function within the context of that animal's life at that particular time and place, which to us translation scholars' ears is not that far from what translators do with human languages. Similarities, right, at least. The prevalent understanding of translation among marine ecologists seem to be a highly restricted version, mainly word for word, rendering of signs, spurred on by technological advances in computer-assisted translation in human languages. This is quite common when people talk about translation, and if they are not within the field of translation and interpreting, that seems to be a common kind of lay people's understanding of translation. But even in human languages, we do know the significance of context, interlocutors, pragmatics, expectations, which all determine the meaning and function of an utterance. An overemphasis on computer-assisted translation, including AI-based systems, may be conceptually narrowing down our capacity to understand something from non-human communication systems. Beyond these restrictions, translation scholars are usually comfortable with the position of both, and we can actually be pretty annoying about this. We say things like, translation is a reproduction as well as a production, right? We do say that. And then we say translators and interpreters have a voice of their own while simultaneously channeling the voices of others, right? Facts of life for translation studies scholars. Millions of words are translated, interpreted every day among hundreds of languages, while those same languages and the various perspectives they carry remain ultimately untranslatable onto each other. Such a both-and perspective may be difficult to accept for the current decoding initiatives of cetacean languages, because they are all spurred on by the ever-expanding promises and speedy delivery of AI. So my own bioacoustician cannot go and say, you know, it's translatable and untranslatable at the same time. It's much more difficult to do it. We also know in translation studies that translation entices, may make things suggestible rather than fully intelligible. It cannot fully elucidate, but it may tease us, give us a taste of other worlds, always at the edge of our comprehension. It may not fully immerse us in other languages and cultures, but it encourages us to be curious, to learn more, rather than an immediate familiarity or consumption. So we are quite comfortable within my discipline about indeterminacy, fluidity, relationality of meaning. Another term I like is dancing around ambiguity. It can be assets, it can be an asset rather than a problem. The question then is whether humans, particularly the scientific and the legal community, can manage to live with the uncertainty of what more than human is saying and still accept that it has a voice. Beyond this both-and perspective and the fact that translation can be quite ambiguous, another point that could be helpful to these efforts of decoding is to distinguish between written translation and oral interpreting. I would argue that interpreting could do better justice to sound-based forms of non-human communication, encouraging them to think about the inherently performative and interpretative aspects of orality, and maybe loosening the straitjacket a term such as translation may enforce upon the understanding of non-human communication systems, so that we don't think about the whale translate as in the case of Google Translate. However, for interpreting rather than translation to become the focus, the emphasis should be moved away from decoding, itself a very dated concept, dating all the way to World War II. Basically, it's quite a militaristic concept, which reduces the process to a matching of written signs. This conceptual shift becomes particularly difficult when the bulk of bioacoustics work is based on training both the researchers and the AI on pattern recognition, like the one you see up there. It's called the spectrogram. That's how the communication systems are visually represented so that scientists can work on them. They still listen to the sounds, but this is what AI usually uses. It's a very visual system. What bioacousticians are doing is akin, I would argue, to the work of early ethnographers, unable to understand a tribal language, annotating it with their visual markers and descriptions of accompanying behavioral patterns. Similar to early ethnographers, considerable othering is also evident. Most of my interviews began with the ecologists underscoring the vastly different medium marine mammals live in. The darkness, how the senses are sound-based, while humans are ostensibly mostly sight-based, the 5 times higher speed of sound in water, so on and so forth. It's clear that it's the differences that fascinated them in the first place. But we know in translation, again, that exoticization among human cultures has its own problematic history, often going hand in hand with oppression and exploitation of the lives in question. This is a very well-known piece of information in translation studies that it's always embedded in power relations. Not only the power to be able to access someone else's thoughts, feelings, or actions, but also the power to interpret and to frame them. To assume translations are unproblematic, egalitarian, apolitical, or transparent is actually a legacy of imperialist, colonial, and patriarchal systems, which traditionally assumed the universality of their own values, disguised as neutrality or objectivity. So how are these unequal power relations reflected in interspecies communication today? We have to remember that cetaceans, particularly the oil extracted from them, formed the backbone of industrial revolution. So here is a little experiment, first of all, to wake you up, and second of all, really to find out what we know about the subject. What was whale oil used for in 18th, 19th, even 20th centuries? Do you have any idea? Candles, lights, yep. Soaps, I hear somebody saying. Margarine, in 1960s, it was one of the main ingredients of margarine. Corsets, baleen, corsets. Yeah, I asked about oil, sorry, but you know, perfumes, spermaceti from sperm whales is still being used in perfumes. Sorry, ambergris, not the spermaceti. Spermaceti was used for lamps, ambergris for perfumes. In a nutshell, you couldn't live in the 19th century in Europe and be away from a whale product more than 2 meters away. It's a bit like us and fossil fuel products today. You know, wherever you see is plastics, at the time, more or less, wherever you looked at it was whale body products, right? And it is very important for us to remember that, because it was the oil of the whales which kind of greased the cogs of industrial revolution. It's a fact that people don't always acknowledge. It is crucial to remember that colonialism thrived on wholesale destruction of entire ecosystems, including the extraction of what is referred to as natural resources, harvesting of various life forms, and slavery of people, all interlinked in very complex ways. In his book, A Decolonial Ecology, Malcolm Ferdinand traces the routes and cargo of colonial ships between France and the Caribbean, England, and Australia. The ships alternated between carrying slaves, whale oil, and female convicts found guilty of petty crimes in Britain, who mostly ended up as wives to male convicts or as sex workers in Australia. Ferdinand thus calls for alliances that are instrumental in turning animal causes and anti-racist, anti-colonial, and feminist struggles into a common problem. This is, of course, not a new argument at all. Since the 1990s, scholars working at the intersection of ecology and feminism have been pointing out the interconnected oppression and domination of women and nature, analyzing the connections among racism, sexism, classicism, colonialism, speciesism, and the environment. What I find particularly interesting in Ferdinand's observations, however, is the shape-shifting nature of this very obsession and exploitation of cetaceans. Ferdinand examines the hunting, trophy hunting, caging, and killing of racialized, gendered, and othered bodies by predominantly white, colonial, capitalist, and patriarchal societies. When his observations are applied to cetaceans, the parallels are painfully clear. Commercial whaling, never fully eradicated, ongoing captivity of dolphins, including orcas, for entertainment, mass strandings of toothed whales around the world due to anthropogenic human-induced noise. All contemporary forms of caging, hunting, and killing. Then there are the seemingly more innocuous forms. Whale watching tours can often turn into trophy hunting. I'm sure you've seen the ubiquitous whale flukes on Instagram. The actual marine science, marine bioacoustic science, can turn into a particular form of trophy hunting by the scientists themselves, because they are trying to find these whales and tag them, even though they deeply care about the fate of the very whales. Establishment of marine sanctuaries and protected areas emerge as different forms of modern caging, albeit a more flexible one. So in contrast to earlier practices bolstered by the idea that non-human life does not talk, feel, and therefore count, contemporary practices operate on the assumption that they in fact do, and therefore should be monitored, contained, and managed for their own good and that of humans. The ongoing translation efforts of cetacean languages fit rather uneasily into this bigger picture. Colonizers often justified the oppression and mass murder of indigenous populations on the grounds that they do not possess a recognizable form of language and culture. Scientific endeavors trying to prove these points went hand in hand with colonization process, from early ethnographic studies that I had referred to measuring, comparing, and displaying human remains, particularly skulls. Similar forms of taxonomy are still evident in the representation of cetaceans in museums and exploration centers around the world. This photo is actually from the Museum of Scotland, just around the corner, right at the entrance. Therefore, it is crucial that more attention is given to whale languages and cultures. However, given the ruthless destruction of whale bodies in the 19th and particularly 20th century, it's impossible to carry out translation of whale languages in a vacuum, disregarding what it entails in terms of power relations. What is often referred to as salvage anthropology in the same centuries, 19th and 20th, collected tribal artifacts and documented oral traditions of indigenous cultures across North America for fear that they were being extinct. Today, decolonization efforts in the museums mainly target human artifacts and remains. A more comprehensive understanding of who was colonized and how is sorely needed for more effective action. Citing an indigenous scholar, Robin Gray, geographer Max Ritz discusses the ongoing rematriation efforts led by indigenous women in North America, which aims to recover and return stolen, misappropriated, or commodified belongings, including sounds. Ritz asks, what would it mean for settlers to depossess the songs that they have taken from these lands and waters? From indigenous musicians, but also from whales, rivers, and wolves. To what horizons might this lead? How might rematriation shift common sense at a time of relentless extraction and enclosure? And I would like to add, what would rematriation look like in whale bioacoustics? Today, we see extensive efforts to release captive cetaceans and bring them back to their birthplaces. And if this cannot be done while they're alive, sometimes their ashes are brought back to the waters they were captured in. Could we imagine a future where recordings of their songs and communications, their oral histories, can equally be rematriated? If such suggestions sound preposterous, we only need to be reminded that rematriation, or indeed repatriation, of indigenous cultural products or our ancestors' remains have been equally controversial until quite recently. Even if we cannot yet know the exact details and benefits of such efforts for the whales themselves, the very idea could help us recognize the trauma we have caused them. And in Yolandi Harris's words, the importance of intergenerational oceans, paving the way for a paradigm shift in our attitudes and behavior towards marine habitats. I mentioned at the start of the talk that I will briefly touch upon this who has the right to represent whom question. This was a debate that started in translation studies, as Aaron kindly summed up, about experiential knowledge, how the body experiences things and how it is difficult to put into words and how we can actually translate it into another language. Beyond translation studies, you might be familiar with same arguments in films, for instance. Can a white actor play another character from a different race? Can a member of the queer community, can a straight person act as a queer character on film? When it comes to the othered, naturalized bodies of the more than human, the same question holds. Who has the right to represent whom? And further questions arise. Who gets to be translated and into whose languages? I mentioned that for a variety of reasons, certain species have the charisma to act as the source languages. I said bottlenose dolphins, humpbacks, sperm whales, and so on. As for the target language, that is in translation studies terms, the language into which their communication systems are going to be translated, there is no competition. It's always English, right? Established as a global lingua franca in the second half of the 20th century, the very language I'm speaking to you particularly dominates international scientific discourse, and yet it's a colonial language par excellence. it's hard to find widespread discussion on the implications of this baggage in bioacoustics research, its findings, interpretation, and dissemination. English is simply taken for granted as the target language, to the exclusion of all other majority languages, as well as minoritized, local, or indigenous languages. A second question, who can avert being translated and thus remain unknowable, uncollectible? This question echoes debates in literary translation. I'm sure colleagues will be familiar with them. Several renowned authors refuse to be translated into the colonized languages of the colonizers in order to refute being known, controlled, appropriated, or collected. Edward Gillison's concept, the right to opacity, is often invoked within the context of indigenous nations. Indigenous writers may actually agree to, or even want translations, but refuse to be translated by those from a settler colonizer background, requesting translators who share their own ethnic, linguistic, class, or gender identities. So where does this leave us when we are talking about whales? They cannot give consent to research. There's no meaningful way of getting consent from them. So the issue becomes particularly intriguing. And the last question about this part of my talk, what is allowed to become a who in the first place? Today, we have these networked hydrophone systems like the one in British Columbia or the whale-safe system in Santa Barbara Channel and the San Francisco Bay Area. They are working 24/7. They are giving a radically different view of whale life. It's not the whale bodies that developed over centuries, the image of the whale bodies that is associated with commercial whaling. Humans now have access to these voices, and it's like, you can now hear my voice, therefore I am. We are beginning to get a glimpse into their complex lives. We know that they form complex societies, and crucially, we know that they are also climate refugees migrating through various legal jurisdictions, which brings me to the final part of my talk, which is hopefully to be published by the Moth Ideas Hub in September 2025. Research on cetacean communication often dovetails with discussions around multi-species justice, a system that can account for the safety, needs, and livelihoods of thriving human and non-human communities. But can we talk about such multi-species justice without talking about communication and translation rights? We would not imagine the same happening in human environment. You cannot imagine a court, for instance, where people are just talking different languages and there's no interpreting going on and nobody's able to understand each other. Today, a great deal of energy and funding is devoted to the possibility of understanding what a cetacean might be saying. And if we do manage to understand, even more energy and money will have to go into securing their translation rights, ensuring, for example, that an entangled humpback will be listened to, understood, and helped accordingly, that a captive beluga will have the right to an interpreter, or that a lost and stranded orca calf will be reunited with its own pod who speaks the same dialect, and not some random group of orcas. As far-fetched as these proposals may sound, they are the logical, ethical consequences of being able to understand cetaceans. Otherwise, without support, without proper infrastructure, we will be just standing by with our hands tied, even though someone somewhere on Earth will be able to translate for these lives in question. On the other hand, I don't need to remind my colleagues here in translation, we know that we are nowhere near providing comprehensive translation and interpreting services for people in dire need of communication as hospitals, courts, police stations. Public interpreting services are subjected to budget cuts non-stop. Multiplicity of human languages makes finding the right interpreter, and dialects makes finding the right interpreter quite difficult. Remote interpreting technology, telephone or video, often fails, leaving all parties stranded. Translation apps are inadequate for dealing with complex matters at best, and downright dangerous in their limitations and mistranslations, especially for minoritized languages. Most importantly, unconscious bias and racism are rampant in institutions, discouraging the service providers to from calling from an interpreter in the first place, even though we obviously need one. Are we really hoping, sorry, this doesn't match. Are we really hoping that things will be better organized for non-humans What will we do if we do begin to understand cetaceans, or any other being for that matter, and are not able to offer them practical, accessible, and affordable ways to be understood? Whales are by their very nature transnational. Their annual migration routes traverse multiple borders and recognize none. As the global climate crisis intensifies, they are venturing beyond their 20th and 21st century habitats. Gray whales have come back into Atlantic once again. Greys and humpbacks are climate refugees in the Arctic, venturing further and further up north, mingling in the same waters as belugas and bowheads. Narwhals in Canadian Arctic are facing predation by killer whales. How could this mobility impact the translation rights of these life forms? When things go wrong, whose jurisdiction would it fall under to arrange for interpreting services? There is currently much promising work carried out around the legal personhood, selfhood of non-human entities, such as forests, like in Ecuador, mountains and rivers in New Zealand. Interestingly, I don't know whether you knew about it, we have a river in the UK which has its own rights, recognized as a legal person, as well as whales and dolphins in the Pacific Islands. I would argue that such legal personhood or selfhood should go hand in hand with communication rights. In an ideal world, an emphasis on interspecies communication should include some degree of global planning, so that the issues of infrastructure, attitude that hinder the provision of satisfactory services for humans will not be even more acute when it comes to non-humans. And perhaps such planning could have a positive ripple effect on language services for all life forms, including the humans. You know, one can always dream. At the moment, it is tempting to focus all the efforts on cracking the code of cetacean languages, but we also need to start thinking about what is the next step, about how future two-way communication can be enabled and sustained, and through which resources, agents, institutions, and technologies. Most importantly, who will be the translator or interpreter in these human-whale communications? I'm asking who and not what specifically, and not only because by that time there will be equally complicated debates about the personhood, legal personhood of AI, but also because in our increasingly disembodied world, the physical presence and immediacy of translators and interpreters carries particular value for understanding the direct physicality of another being's experiences, whether they are human, whale, or barnacle. Only with this kind of embodied intimacy can our current efforts to understand cetacean communication systems reach their ultimate goal, to give voice to the more than human who have been rendered voiceless, often violently. Thank you.